of U.S. authors. Works as the manager of projects for the International Creative Commons office in Germany. Carolina Botero is an attorney in Colombia with 2 master's degrees, one in international law and cooperation, and another in the rights of commerce and contracts. She is currently in the doctoral program with the Autonomous University of Barcelona, Spain. She's a leader of Creative Commons in Colombia and director of the working group in Internet Law of the Charisma Foundation. She also is coordinating the Spanish community of Open Ed. You can begin your presentation. I don't know how we can put this up completely, but we'll see what we can do. Good morning. We're here to tell you about the legal parts about open educational resources, and our presentation is called Creative Commons Licenses, How to Maximize OERs. We'd like to begin with the contextualization about the issues or concept that we've been dealing with over the last few years in the fusion between education and technology, particularly with the arrival of Internet. And in this way, we have become accustomed to a bunch of jargon, virtual learning objects, e-learning, learning objects, open courseware, virtual courses. We use a lot of jargon, and these new concepts, we're putting one more, which is open educational resource. So, first of all, to be able to think about this idea, these concepts, might be to think about how in day-to-day pedagogical practice we need many different elements to support teachers in the educational process. This chart shows clearly how any resource, data, photograph, through the context that gives the knowledge that the teacher has to virtualize it, comes into much more complex processes such as courses. This complexity, which is clear for a teacher in pedagogical sense, to build educational material, also clearly reflects the problem regarding copyright, because in a photograph it's easy to identify who took the picture, but when it becomes part of a broader context, this context makes it complex in terms of copyright. There are more authors involved, but this also enables us to look at the modularity and reuse issue, because while we're on the left side of the chart, these elements are more reusable and more modular. The further we go to the right, the less reusable and modular they are. This possibility of reuse goes to management of copyright. Much of this terminology that we're talking about is just a way to adapt practices from the classroom into new pedagogical practices for young people who are growing up in the 21st century. Here are a series of definitions, which I'm sure this presentation will be on the website. You can look at it in greater detail, but it shows the evolution that the concept has had of virtual learning objects, which gives great meaning. We begin talking strongly about the technological aspect. A moment ago, we just talked about the 3 elements of open courseware, talking about the teacher, the technical, and the legal aspect. So here we have the teaching part is putting in their part. We're beginning to see the need to begin talking about the technological aspects, but when it's a learning object, we emphasize the technological part. We talk about standards, and when we give it a very important framework about metadata, often learning objects become like the tail of a huge metadata comment that tries to explain everything to make interoperability easy. So then we have the educational resource, but in the classroom you can use anything, and just anything in an educational context has significance for that learning process. So now we're talking about open educational resources. And the open educational resource is the summation or evolution of this type of concepts. What is an open educational resource? It's educational content. These are complete courses or course materials. It's everything that the professor would ordinarily use in the classroom. These are tools because this is all of the software support, the technology that can make it easier to put what we do in the classroom into the technological environment. There are also implementation resources, and here is where the legal part comes in. These are resources that you need to facilitate the educational environment with technological characteristics and the way that we will disseminate it. In this complete context is when we talk about open educational resources beyond the virtual learning object and the learning object and even educational resources. If you can see, the element that begins to appear here is the legal part. So what happens then when you start talking about open educational resources?
Pido mis disculpas porque mi español es horrible, así que
So
voy
just
a
like to
hablar.
say thank you to the university for organizing this and letting us speak here. So to follow up with Carolina's summary of OER, we want to go into the details about one of the standards that the OER infrastructure is using, and that's Creative Commons and the Creative Commons licensing suite. So just as an overview, there's 6 standard licenses that you can choose from. They're free to use, the licenses. Creative Commons nor anyone that we're associated with earns money from the fact that you've used the license itself. You can, excuse me. We'll go into the details of the different licenses in a few moments, but at the moment I would like to talk about some of the advantages or some of the aspects of the licensing suite, particularly the internationalization of Creative Commons. So the suite has what's called an unported license, which is based on international copyright laws and treaties, but it also has been adapted to the national laws of jurisdictions around the world. So several in Latin America, including in Ecuador, as an example. And this means that the license, the legal code, has been modified and adapted to the Ecuadorian law, for example. And we encourage you to use this ported license, so a license from your jurisdiction in the event that you are, if you anticipate a high level of use of your content within your country. It also increases the understandability or the comprehension of what's actually being licensed and how. So a question we often get is, that sounds great, but how do we actually use a license and where do we find it? And one method to do this is to visit our website, creativecommons.org. And in the middle of the site, you'll find a link to license. And this takes you to what's called a license chooser. This is available in Spanish as well. And it asks you a series of questions. And the idea behind that is to help you determine which license best fits your needs. And so you answer the simple questions, and you can also select your jurisdiction. And a license is generated for you. And this has some key components. There's at the bottom of the screenshot, you'll see a snippet of code. This code can be to your online data. And the advantage of this, which is something I'd like to emphasize and builds upon the point of the evolution of open educational resources, is that metadata is increasingly important. That you can create as much things as you want and you can share them around the world, but if people can't find them, if people don't know how to attribute and respect their rights properly, then you're missing out a lot. So we encourage you to use the metadata, which is, in this example, automatically generated from the license chooser. Perhaps you're also familiar with the structure of the different licenses when you click on the badge seen previously. This is called the human readable layer, which is supposed to be accessible for the non-lawyers among us. It's supposed to say in a clear and easy to understand way what you can and can't do with your work, and using the icons to create a standard visual signal to what the license is actually allowing. This is the German port, but this is also available in Ecuador, Colombia, Guatemala, several other countries. Then if you want to know what's actually being said underneath the license, you can click onto the legal code, which, as I mentioned before, has been adapted to various countries and says in a way that's understandable in courts what you are licensing and how. So an example of how this is implemented is from the CC Ecuador site. As I showed in the former slide, you can insert this code snippet, and generated at the bottom is this badge, which clearly signals how that work is available. So to go back, that was just an overview, but I think we're all here and much more interested in the educational aspects of these tools. So I'd like to introduce a division of Creative Commons called CC Learn. Carolina will speak more about their projects in detail, but among several things that they do, they publish reports and recommendations for the use of OER. And one of their recommendations came out, it was supported by the Hewlett Foundation institutions, and asked them what are their licensing practices, how are they using the content, how are they making it available. So what came out of this survey was in some ways very positive, but also there's work to be done. They found that the terms of use for a majority of courseware material, OER, is very unclear. It's either hidden within pages of links, or it's not labeled properly, or there is a lot of confusion about exactly which components, which aspects of the content are licensed in which ways. They also found that the majority of OER, of these educational institutions, have adopted a standardized license. The most of them have adopted a CC license. However, a strong minority, use their own customized license. And while this might seem like an advantage to institutions, it's creating a lot of incompatibility issues. So as a group altogether from this survey of several hundred organizations, there was a diverse use of licensing and in some cases an incompatible use. So a plea or a trend or something that we should work towards is to be clearer and more specific in how we are licensing the material, and to be aware of compatibility issues. Oops, sorry. Another conclusion that came from this report is the fact that Creative Commons licenses are a standard within this environment. So this is going to help resolve the previous problem, which is uncertainty with how you can use works. So using Creative Commons licenses becomes the de facto infrastructure. Customizing licenses can also be problematic, so we encourage you not to take that route. Furthermore, to really maximize the materials that you create, we encourage you to use a CC BY license or a CC attribution license, which is a license that only requires attribution upon reuse and distribution. In a moment, and it's I think the way to give people the most impact. So the point about this is, if you're looking into licensing, if you're looking into using this standard infrastructure, think about the consequences of the license that you choose. There's a variety of choice out there, and we encourage creators to use the tools that fit their needs, but we also encourage you to really think about what does it mean to use a particular license. So we have a license condition called no derivatives. This, although it allows you to protect the integrity of your work, people can't translate it, people can't localize it, people can't do a lot of things with it. So it's a heavy decision to make to use this licensing element. There's also the non-commercial element, and although you might think that this is kind of a soft or a clear decision that you're working in an educational field, and of course education in some contexts will be non-commercial, etc. There's the consideration that actually it's very unclear to users what commercial and non-commercial is. So if you do not use this licensing element, you make it 100% clear to users what you are allowing them to do. There's another licensing element. It's our copyleft licensing element called share-alike. And this also has a lot of proponents, because if you use a share-alike license, you are encouraging the continuation of an open pool of resources. However, the share-alike condition creates some conditions that make it more difficult to use the work and to combine it in different ways. So we also encourage you to consider even the share-alike element as a level of complexity that might prohibit some usage. So again, just to overview, there's 6 available licenses that combine the various licensing elements that I described. And for OER, we strongly recommend to just use the attribution license, the one that's listed above. There's also, of course, the option of the public domain. We have a tool called CC0, and this is another great trend. If you are deciding that even the attribution element is not necessary for our use, and you want to even clear the way further for maximizing reuse, localization, customization, etc., then the public domain is a great option to do that.
Bueno, queremos además mostrar un poco cuáles son los proyectos
that, particularly in our Latin American region, are being implemented. But first of all, I would like to first mention that the projects related to open educational resources are set up within models in the United States and in Europe have been tested. And this may be a good way to compare projects, is to look at 2 different, both for OERs, but with connections. Looking at it, analyzing the documents that have been written on comparisons of the different structures, we can learn a lot of what is being implemented in other countries. What Michelle was saying is the vision of Creative Commons, after looking at the state of the art, so to speak, what's been happening particularly in the developed countries, which is where the idea of OERs has been implemented the most, and the most experience has been obtained. Nevertheless, what's clear is that in countries like ours, the situation is quite different vis-a-vis the decision-making regarding the element of intellectual property. One project, as we just heard, that has most promoted the idea of OERs has been Conferencia for disseminating open courseware for Latin America, which has enabled many universities to link with this topic. Nevertheless, in the concrete copyright issue, there's still a lot of ignorance, but lack of decision by universities about this issue. Many universities that have joined this have not yet decided. They haven't undertaken the commitment regarding openness in a specific copyright issue. So they lose the momentum of the principles underlying the idea of open courseware. So in any event, this is one of the projects. It's important in our region. Another issue that might be good to mention is the national projects of learning object repositories in our region. Almost all Latin American countries have a project led by the Ministry of Education. The one on the screen is the Colombian Colombia Learns, but it's repeated on almost every country. And for the last 3 years, Colombia is one of the countries, along with Chile and Mexico, educational website for Latin America. This network of educational websites for Latin America includes among its principles to allow learning objects that are brought together in the repository as a public initiative could be shared with all of the ideas underlying this, which is the quality, so then the use in the different educational settings and so on. Nevertheless, about the same thing happens that I was mentioning regarding Universia. There are universities that have adopted either their own license or Creative Commons, and they've made the decision in this regard, but many others have not yet decided. And when they haven't decided, they're adopting all rights reserved. So it means that what you can do is showcase their educational resource, but not reuse it, which is so necessary for the context in which OERs are to be used. The interesting thing, in any event, about these Latin American educational websites fostered by the public sector, I'll give you the Colombian case that, while Colombia Learns, they also say that in the national repository, it's for open educational resource, but they can't impose condition on the universities. So there's all kinds of educational resources. If you're trying to get the educational resources that fulfill at least the minimum legal permits to put them on the network. So in the RELPE, there's an initial filter that enables countries to play around with the educational resources on this platform. Now, in the private sector, the university sector, the universities per se, the movement, the idea of openness, and above all, the awareness that intellectual property is one of the elements that is necessary for the process has expanded greatly. Here we have, as an example on the screen, the Private Technical University of Loja, our hosts today, who have this philosophy. And they've adopted the Creative Commons license, but the most restrictive one, which we should analyze in greater depth, but this is the way it is. So in Latin America, other universities have made specific decisions vis-a-vis intellectual property. We have, for example, the university in Peru, the chair, moderator for this session, and Applied Sciences, the Bolivarian University in Colombia, Francisco Marroquín in Guatemala, the University of Chile, the Fluxo, the Latin American Faculty of Social Sciences website, the Virtual School of UNDP, United Nations. There have been a bunch of institutions that have begun moving. It would be too long to list them all. We could have an idea about it, how we're doing in this direction. These universities have been taking the first step. Now they have to analyze the decision that they've made and look at how to improve their own practices. But there is this movement. The next issue we'd like to address is the Open Educational Resources Project within Creative Commons, which is one of the frequent questions. So what is Creative Commons? And then it has the project called See, Learn, which is precisely the project for teachers, trying to address the way to overcome barriers for circulating educational material. In CC Learn, there are a number of different projects such as Discover Ed, to find educational resources on the network. There are a number of projects for publications. One, the report that Michelle mentioned. There are databases called ODEPU, but just now we'd like to concentrate on one which is called Open Ed, which is a wiki. It's a website to make visible resources, projects, news, sites, institutions that are committed to the idea of educational resources, open educational resources. Well, the one that we're going to highlight and tell you about with the Spanish community, to talk about this issue in Spanish. So to see to look for each other, to talk to each other in Spanish, to do the issues in our own language. So I'd like to invite you to all look at it, to fill it up so that we can have a more fruitful dialogue. I think we're coming up against our time limit. Thank you.